He slid the envelope across the table like it was nothing, like 12 years meant nothing, like the woman sitting across from him, 7 months pregnant, still wearing the ring he'd placed on her finger in front of 200 people, meant nothing. Kang Tae-jun didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over the back, and said the words with the same casual authority he used to terminate business contracts. I want a divorce, Imani. I've met someone who loves me for who I am. The rain hit the penthouse windows in sheets. Somewhere below, Seattle kept moving, indifferent. Imani Whitaker looked at her husband of 12 years and felt something in her chest go very, very quiet. Not broken, not shattered. Quiet. The way a room goes quiet right before something in it catches fire. If you've ever given everything to someone who treated it like a convenience, stay with me. Subscribe, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels, because what Imani does next is something none of us saw coming, and neither did he. The restaurant was called Ilara, 52 floors above the city, and Tae-jun had chosen it deliberately. He always chose locations with strategic precision, places where emotional scenes would be contained by the social pressure of white tablecloths and ambient lighting, places where a woman wouldn't raise her voice, places that made a man feel in control simply by virtue of the altitude. Imani had dressed carefully that evening. Navy wrap dress, the one that still buttoned cleanly over her belly. Low heels because her ankles had started swelling 2 weeks ago. She told herself she was dressing for an anniversary dinner. She had made a reservation note with Danielle, her CFO, and the closest thing to a best friend that a woman running 3 companies while 7 months pregnant could maintain, that she would be unreachable from 7 to 9. 2 hours. A real dinner with her husband. No phones. She'd even left her laptop in the car. Tae-jun had ordered the wine list before she arrived. That was the first thing she noticed. He always ordered wine when he wanted to control the pace of a conversation. It gave him something to do with his hands, something to gesture with, something to make the other person wait while he considered the label. He didn't pour her a glass. That was the second thing she noticed. He looked good. He always looked good. 41, and the years had carved his face into something sharper, more deliberate. The jaw set at an angle that communicated authority without effort. The silver threading through his hair worn with the comfort of a man who had never once in his adult life worried about being perceived as old. He wore the charcoal suit she'd had altered at Parks on 5th because he'd gained 8 pounds and refused to admit it, and she'd quietly handled it so he wouldn't have to feel embarrassed. She remembered waiting 40 minutes for that fitting. She sat down. He waited until the server left. Then he slid the envelope across the white linen. Imani looked at it without touching it. Thick paper, cream-colored. Her name written on the front in Tae-jun's handwriting. Not typed, handwritten, which meant he had rehearsed this, which meant he had thought about it long enough to write her name with his own hand and still decided to do it. Open it, he said. Tell me what it is first. He took a breath, set down his wine glass. And then he said it, measured, calm, with the particular composure of a man who had already made the decision and was simply delivering the information now, the way you inform an employee that their position has been eliminated. I want a divorce. I found someone. Someone who... He stopped, adjusted. Someone who sees me differently. The ambient music played. A couple 2 tables over laughed at something private. Imani sat perfectly still. Her name is Yuna Park, Tae-jun continued, because her silence seemed to discomfort him more than he'd expected. She's someone I've come to know through the foundation. We didn't plan it. It happened over time, and I know this is difficult. How old is she? He hesitated. 25. Imani looked at the candle between them. The flame moved with the ventilation, small and restless. You're 41, she said. Age isn't... I'm 37 and 7 months pregnant with your child, Tae-jun. The words dropped into the silence like something solid. He had the grace to look away, briefly. Then the composure reasserted itself, because composure was the armor he had never once removed in 12 years of marriage, and she had spent years mistaking it for strength. I know the timing is... Stop! Her voice was quiet. It was always quiet when she was at her most serious. It was the voice she used in boardrooms when someone had made an accounting error that was going to cost her company money. Not loud, not heated, just final. I need you to be honest with me right now. Not diplomatic, honest. He said nothing. Is she living in the Meridian unit? Taejun's expression shifted, a fractional tightening around the eyes. The Meridian was a high-end residential building in Capitol Hill. Imani's property trust owned unit 1408. That's not relevant to... It is relevant. That is my building, Taejun. Is she in my unit? The pause was long enough to be its own answer. Imani picked up her phone. What are you doing? He said. Not to question. The tone of a man accustomed to controlling rooms. Calling Danielle. Imani, this is not the time to... It's exactly the time. She pressed the call button. The line picked up on the second ring because Danielle Rains had been Imani's CFO for 6 years and had learned early that calls after 7 p.m. were never casual. Danielle, I need you to freeze every personal account connected to Taejun's name. All of them. Tonight. I also need access to the Meridian's tenant records pulled by morning. She could hear Taejun's breathing change across the table. Done, Danielle said, without a single question, because she was that kind of professional. Anything else? Yes. Pull the Foundation's financial statements for the last 18 months. Every expenditure connected to the Whitaker Cultural Initiative. I want it on my desk by 8. Understood. Imani ended the call. Taejun was staring at her. The composure had cracked in exactly one place, his jaw muscle, working at the hinge, the way it did when something had bypassed his preparation. You cannot do that, he said. I just did. She rested her phone on the table. Her hand drifted almost involuntarily to the curve of her belly. You wanted a love that doesn't need my money. You told me she loves the man beneath all of this. Her eyes moved across the tailored suit, the cufflinks she'd bought him in Geneva, the watch his mother had never paid for. Now you get to find out if that's true. She picked up her bag. She did not cry. She stood, 7 months along, steadied herself once against the table edge. Just once, the only moment of visible effort she would allow herself in front of him, and walked across Alara's polished floor toward the elevator. She did not look back. She would think about that later, the not looking back. She wasn't sure if it was dignity or discipline or simply the fact that her legs were carrying her forward and stopping felt more dangerous than moving. The elevator doors closed. Imani exhaled once, hard, pressing the lobby button and watching her own reflection in the polished brass doors. 37 years old, 7 months pregnant, hair pinned back, dress still sitting right, earrings still in. She looked exactly like a woman who had things together. She pressed her palm flat over her stomach. The baby moved. A slow, rolling shift, the particular movement that had started in the 6th month and that she'd come to think of as Amelia asserting herself, not kicking exactly, more like turning over in her sleep, repositioning, reminding Imani she was there. I know, Imani said quietly, to nobody. The lobby arrived. She walked out of Alara and into the rain. Danielle was waiting in the car, not because Imani had asked her to be, but because Danielle had learned over 6 years to read the temperature of a late-night phone call, and the temperature of this one had told her to be exactly where she was, engine running, outside the building. Imani got in. She sat for 3 seconds in silence. Then she said, He's been living in the Meridian unit. Danielle's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Which one? That's our unit. I know that. Imani. I know. Danielle didn't push further. She pulled into traffic, and the Seattle rain hit the windshield and curtains, and neither woman spoke for 4 blocks. Then Imani said, He said she loves him for who he is. Danielle said nothing. The foundation is financing her scholarship, her apartment stipend, her fellowship. Imani's voice was entirely even, but her hand had not left her stomach. I've been paying for his girlfriend. The car moved through the rain. Signal, turn, merge. The foundation statements will tell us more, Danielle said. I know what they'll tell us. Danielle glanced at her in the mirror. What do you need right now? Imani looked at the city moving past the glass. 12 years of it. 12 years of knowing which restaurants Taejun preferred, which suits made him look powerful, which investors needed to be managed, which family members needed to be funded quietly so the peace held. 12 years of structuring her companies around the shape of his ambitions. 12 years of carrying the weight of a world she'd largely built and had no controlling interest in. I need to go see my kids. Danielle drove. The Whitaker family residence in Madrona was a place Imani had bought herself, in her own name, 3 years into the marriage, because she had grown up watching her mother sleep on a cousin's couch after a relationship ended, and she had decided, at age 26, that she would never be in that position. She had never told Taijun about the transaction in terms he understood. He knew she owned the house. He didn't understand that owning the house had always been the point. She let herself in with her own key. The twins were upstairs. 11 years old, both of them, Naomi and Caleb, born 14 minutes apart on a Tuesday in March, and equally convinced they were the rightful center of the family. The au pair, a quiet Haitian-American woman named Rosie, who had worked for Imani for 3 years, was doing dishes when Imani came in. "Mrs. Kong," Rosie said, and then took one look at her face and said nothing else. "Are they asleep?" Naomi is reading. Caleb is supposed to be asleep. Imani climbed the stairs with the particular careful weight of a woman in her 3rd trimester, one hand on the railing, taking her time with it. She stopped at Caleb's door first. He was not asleep. He was on his back, staring at the ceiling with the expression of a child who has been thinking too hard about something he didn't have the language for. "Hey," she said. "Mom." He sat up immediately. 11-year-old boys were not supposed to look relieved to see their mothers, and he was at the age where he knew this, but he did anyway. "You're back early. Dinner got short." She sat on the edge of his bed. "You okay?" He shrugged. The universal answer of an 11-year-old who was not okay and didn't know how to say it. "Caleb, Grandma Misuk called today," he said at last. Imani went still. "She said—" He stopped, pulled at a thread on his comforter. "She said Dad might be going through a hard time, and that sometimes when dads go through hard times, families need to be extra supportive and understanding." Imani looked at her son's face. He was Taijun's cheekbones and her eyes, always, that combination that made people on the street stop them sometimes. He was also 11 years old and being fed information through a grandmother with a stake in the outcome. "What else did she say?" Caleb didn't answer right away. "Caleb?" "She said you were being controlling." He said it fast, like removing a bandage. "About the money stuff." Imani breathed, in and out. She kept her face steady. "Okay," she said. "Thank you for telling me." "Mom, what's happening?" She looked at her son, really looked at him, and decided that he deserved something true. "Your dad and I are having a disagreement," she said, "about the future. It's serious, and I won't pretend it isn't. But whatever happens between me and your father, nothing changes for you and Naomi. You understand that?" "Is it because of a woman?" he asked, in the quiet voice of a child who has heard too much through walls. The silence lasted exactly long enough to be its own answer, and Caleb's face did something complicated that he was too young to fully control. "Hey," Imani said, and put her arm around him, awkward with the belly, imprecise, both of them adjusting. And her 11-year-old son leaned into her shoulder, and she held him there in the dark of his room, while the Seattle rain kept falling and the baby turned over inside her and the envelope on a restaurant table. 52 floors above the city began the slow work of dismantling everything Taijun Kong had spent 12 years taking for granted. She sat with Caleb until his breathing slowed and evened. Then she went to Naomi. Naomi was sitting up, book open, light on, and she looked up when her mother came in with the expression of a girl who was already more perceptive than was comfortable for anyone. "You know," Imani said. Not a question. Naomi closed her book. "I heard Grandma on the phone with Dad last week. She called her Yuna." The name in her daughter's mouth was a different kind of thing than it had been in Taijun's. "Come here," Imani said. Naomi crossed the room and sat beside her, and Imani held her older by 14 minutes daughter in silence for a long time, and neither of them spoke, and outside the rain made its sound against the glass. Imani did not cry. She would save that for later, alone, in a room no one else would see. That night, lying in the Madrona house in the bed she had bought herself long before she needed a reason to, she opened her email and found Danielle's preliminary figures already waiting. 6 months of activity through the foundation accounts. $48,712 in expenditures traceable to a single recipient profile. Hotel rooms in Vancouver, flights to New York, jewelry purchases at 3 separate retailers, a studio rental in Belltown. Imani read the figures twice. Then she forwarded the file to her attorney, Marcus Webb, with a single line. "We have contamination. Corporate accounts. Call me at 7. She set her phone on the nightstand. She put her hand on her stomach. "I'm not going to let this be the story," she said quietly, to the dark room, to the baby who couldn't hear her yet. "He doesn't get to write the ending." The rain fell. The baby moved. Imani Whitaker stared at the ceiling and did not sleep and started planning. Marcus Webb picked up on the first ring. It was 6:53 in the morning, 7 minutes before Imani had said she would call, and that 7 minutes told her everything she needed to know about how seriously he was taking the file she had sent at 2 a.m. "I read it 3 times, he said, without preamble. And if those transactions are what they look like, your husband has been running personal expenditures through your corporate infrastructure for the better part of 6 months. A pause. The sound of paper. That's not a marital dispute, Imani. That's fraud adjacent. Depending on how the accounts are structured, it could constitute misappropriation. Imani was sitting at the kitchen table in the Madrona house with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, and the preliminary spreadsheet open on her laptop. Outside, the rain had stopped somewhere around 4 in the morning and left Seattle gray and washed out and very still. "How do I protect the companies?" she said. "Immediately? You freeze the disputed accounts, you get an independent auditor into the foundation's books before anyone else touches them, and you retain me formally, so everything we discuss is privileged." Another pause. "I also need you to think about whether this stays in divorce proceedings or whether you want it to become something else." "What do you mean, something else?" "I mean whether you want to pursue it criminally." Imani looked at the spreadsheet. $48,712. Hotel rooms, flights, jewelry. A studio in Belltown that a 25-year-old graduate student had apparently been living in on Imani's foundation's dime. "Not yet," she said. "Right now I need the companies clean and the divorce ironclad." "I can do that. I need you in my office this afternoon." "I'll be there at 2. She ended the call and sat with the silent kitchen for a moment. Upstairs she could hear Rosie moving, the particular creak of the hallway floorboard outside Naomi's room. Normal morning sounds, the sounds of a house that was still functioning even though everything beneath the surface had fractured overnight. She called Danielle. "Did you sleep?" Danielle asked. "A little. I need you to get ahead of something today." Imani turned the laptop screen toward herself, though she already had the numbers memorized. "The Meridian unit. I need a formal notice of lease termination prepared. 30 days, standard language, no personal commentary." Silence on the other end. "Danielle, you're evicting her." "I'm terminating a lease on my property. There's a legal distinction." "Imani, she may not even know." "I know she may not know. That doesn't change what the unit is or who it belongs to." Imani picked up the coffee and took the first sip. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. "The notice goes through property management, not from me personally, clean and professional." "Okay." Danielle's voice was careful. "And Tajun's access cards to the Westlake office?" Imani had almost forgotten. Tajun held a courtesy access card to the Westlake building, which housed 2 of Whitaker Holdings' subsidiary operations. He had used it approximately 4 times in 3 years, mostly to impress clients by walking through the lobby with the particular authority of a man who wanted people to believe he owned things he didn't own. "Deactivated," Imani said. "This morning." "Done." A beat. "Are you okay?" "I'm functional." "That's not the same thing." "No," Imani said. "It isn't." She hung up and went to wake her children. Caleb came down to breakfast with the dark circles of a boy who hadn't slept enough, and the pride of one who wouldn't admit it. Naomi came down 2 minutes later with her hair in a braid she'd done herself, imperfect, slightly off-center, and sat down at the table with the particular composure of a girl who had decided, sometime in the night, to be steady. Imani made eggs, not because she was hungry, not because the domesticity of it felt meaningful, but because her hands needed something to do, and her children needed to see her standing at the stove on a Thursday morning as if the world were still level. "Is Dad coming this weekend?" Caleb asked. Imani cracked the 3rd egg against the bowl's rim. Clean break. I'm going to talk to your dad today about scheduling. That means no, Naomi said, not unkindly. It means I don't have an answer yet. Caleb pushed scrambled egg around his plate. Grandma Misuk is calling again today. She told me last night. Imani turned from the stove. She called you last night. After you came in, and on my cell. Imani kept her face neutral. Misuk calling an 11-year-old at night, after his mother had just come home from the dinner that ended a marriage, to prime him for whatever story was being constructed. That was not an accident. That was a woman protecting her son's position by working every available channel. If she calls today, Imani said, you can talk to her. But I want you to know that whatever she tells you about what's happening between me and your father, you can always come to me and ask me directly, and I will tell you the truth. Naomi looked at her steadily. What is the truth? 12 years old last March, going on 40. She had her father's directness without his cruelty and her mother's precision without her restraint. And she sat at the breakfast table with her off-center braid and her clear eyes and asked the question like she actually expected an answer. The truth, Imani said, is that your father and I are going to separate, and it is going to be hard for a while, and then it is going to be okay. Is there someone else? Naomi asked. The eggs were burning slightly at the edges. Imani turned back to the pan. Yes, she said, because she had promised the truth. There is. The kitchen was very quiet. Okay, Naomi said at last. Just that. Caleb said nothing. When Imani looked at him, his jaw was set at an angle that was so purely, painfully his father's that it knocked the air out of her for a second. The Kong jaw, the one that meant he was holding something in and would not be moved. She put the eggs on plates and sat down, and they ate breakfast together in a silence that was not comfortable but was honest, and she thought that honesty, even when it hurt, was something she could build on. Taejun called at 9:47. Imani was in the car on her way to the office. She let it ring twice, then answered. You froze everything, he said. Good morning, Taejun. Imani. His voice was controlled. Barely. The particular tension of a man who had spent the night discovering exactly how many things in his life stopped functioning when one woman made 3 phone calls. You cannot do this unilaterally. We have a discussion to have. We had the discussion last night. You handed me an envelope. That envelope was a conversation opener. It was a divorce filing. Your attorney's letterhead was on the cover page. She signaled left, merged. I read it. A pause. When he spoke again, the control had tightened another degree. The house, the cards, the office access, all of that is mine, Taejun, legally, structurally. My name is on every document. She kept her voice even. You have always known this. I have clients who expect your clients are your concern. Mine are mine. She pulled into the parking structure. I'll have Marcus send over preliminary divorce terms by end of week. In the meantime, I've asked that communication about the children go through Rosie's scheduling line. If there's a medical emergency or something involving Naomi or Caleb directly, you call my cell. Otherwise, use the line. You are not going to manage my access to my own children. I am managing the terms of communication during a period when you have demonstrated poor judgment, and I do not yet trust the people you're surrounding yourself with to have access to my family's schedule. Her voice did not rise. It never rose. That is not punishment. That is reasonable caution. She heard him breathe, sharp, through the nose. The sound he made when someone had placed a limit he hadn't anticipated. Where is she staying? He said abruptly. Yuna, you sent a notice. The notice went through property management. She called me. She was crying. Imani picked up her bag and got out of the car. The parking structure was cold and smelled of damp concrete. The unit belongs to my trust. I'm sorry she's distressed, but the unit belongs to my trust. She didn't know, Taejun said. And for the first time, there was something in his voice that was not control, not strategy, something raw and cornered. She didn't know about the foundation, about any of it. I told her I owned. I know what you told her. Imani walked toward the elevator. That's between you and her. Imani, find her somewhere to live, Taejun. That's what a man does for a woman he loves. She ended the call. The elevator opened. She stepped in, pressed the button for the 14th floor, and watched the parking structure disappear as the doors closed. Her reflection looked back at her. She touched the wall of the elevator with 2 fingers, steadying herself. Just for a second. Then the doors opened, and she walked into the office. The Whitaker Holdings offices on the 14th floor of the Westlake building were hers in every sense. The layout, the furniture, the particular way the reception desk was positioned so that her team could see the elevator and greet anyone who came off it. She had designed the space herself, in the early years, when the company was small enough that she knew every employee by name and schedule. Now there were 31 people in this office alone, with satellite operations in Atlanta and Denver, and she did not know everyone's schedule anymore, but she still knew every person's name. Danielle was waiting by the conference room with a printed copy of the foundation's financial statements, a yellow legal pad, and the expression of a woman who had been awake since 5. "The auditor can be here by noon," Danielle said, walking alongside her. "Independent firm, no previous relationship with Tyjan or any of his associated entities. I checked." "Good." Imani dropped her bag in her office, turned immediately. "Show me the foundation breakdown." They spread the statements across the conference table. The numbers were worse than the preliminary figures had suggested. Not dramatically. The total contamination was still in the 50,000 range, but the specificity of it was damning. The Whitaker Cultural Initiative had been structured as a legitimate philanthropic foundation, funding arts scholarships, cultural programming, and community grants across the Pacific Northwest. It had a board of 3, of which Imani was the founding director and primary funder. It had Taejun listed as a non-executive cultural advisor, a title she'd given him 4 years ago because he'd asked for it, and she'd been in the habit of giving him things he asked for without examining why he wanted them. That title had given him signature authority on a secondary operations account. He had used it to move money. Not large amounts at any single moment, nothing that would trigger an automatic review. 1,100 here, 2,200 there, folded into legitimate foundation expenses with just enough supporting documentation to pass a casual review. Hotel receipts coded as conference accommodations, flight expenses coded as board travel. The studio rental in Belltown listed as a cultural programming space. Imani looked at the Belltown entry. "The studio," she said. Danielle nodded. "Monthly rental, 14 months. Coded as what?" "Artist residency space, Whitaker Cultural Initiative programming." Imani closed her eyes. Just briefly. Just for a count of 3, 14 months. She had been unknowingly financing the woman's living space for 14 months. While pregnant. While managing 3 companies. While believing, in whatever compartmentalized corner of her mind she'd kept the state of her marriage, that things between her and Taejun were strained in the normal, manageable way that things between busy people sometimes became strained. She opened her eyes. "Pull the artist residency programming file," she said. "I want to see what documentation exists for that studio space." "There is none," Danielle said quietly. Of course there wasn't. "Okay," Imani straightened. "When Marcus gets here?" "He's already here," Danielle said. "Downstairs lobby. I told him to, but he came at 10:30. Imani almost smiled. "Send him up." Marcus Webb was 53, a black man from Atlanta who had been practicing family law and corporate litigation for 26 years, and who had the particular unruffled quality of someone who had sat across from people in the worst moments of their lives for so long that nothing surprised him anymore. He walked into the conference room, looked at the statements spread across the table, poured himself a coffee from the side credenza without asking, and sat down. 14 months, he said, reading. 14 months, Imani confirmed. He had signature authority. "I gave it to him." Marcus looked at her. Not with judgment, just clear-eyed professional assessment. "That complicates recovery but doesn't preclude it. The authority was limited in scope. We argue he exceeded it." He turned a page. "More importantly, this gives us significant leverage in the divorce settlement." "I don't want to use it as leverage," Imani said. Marcus and Danielle both looked at her. "I want it clean," she said. "I want it accurate. I want the settlement to reflect what is real and what is mine. If the foundation contamination is part of what's real, then it goes in the settlement as documentation, not as a weapon." "Imani," Marcus said carefully, "there's a difference between—" "I know the difference. I'm telling you what I want." She sat down across from him. "I don't want to destroy him. I want to separate from him. Those are 2 different projects." Marcus held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. That shapes how we proceed." He opened his legal pad. Let's talk about the prenuptial agreement. The prenuptial agreement had been Amani's idea, 12 years ago, before the wedding. Taejun had signed it with the easy confidence of a man who had never once believed the relationship would end. It was a clean document, separate property protections, no commingling of assets without explicit written agreement, clear provisions for any business interest developed during the marriage. Her attorney at the time had called it thorough. Marcus, reading it now, called it watertight. He gets what he came in with, Marcus said. Adjusted for 12 years, which means not much. He has his own organization, Amani said. His own legitimate businesses, which have been subsidized. Some of them, not all. She tapped the table. I want an independent assessment of what he built on his own. Whatever that is, he keeps it without dispute. Marcus wrote something. And the children. Primary physical custody with me. Liberal visitation for him, structured. No overnight stays at any residence where Unipark is present until the children's therapist, and they will have a therapist, I'm arranging that this week, signs off on it. He'll push back on that. He can push back. Marcus wrote more. The conference room was quiet except for the scratch of his pen and the distant sound of the office outside. Then Danielle's phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it. Her expression changed. Not dramatically, but Imani had worked beside her long enough to read the small shifts. What? Imani said. Danielle turned the phone. It was a message from their office manager downstairs. 2 words and a name. Mai Sook. Lobby. Kang Mai Sook had come to Imani's office. Imani sat with that information for exactly 5 seconds. Then she stood. Excuse me. Marcus started to say something, caution in his posture, the instinct of a lawyer who has seen well-meaning confrontations go wrong. Imani shook her head once. She went to the elevator. Misuk was standing in the lobby when Imani came off the elevator. 64 years old, immaculately presented in the way of a woman who considered appearance a form of discipline, silver hair cut cleanly at the jaw. She had the posture of someone who had grown up being told to stand correctly and had never stopped. She had also, for 11 years, accepted Imani's financial support for her medical treatment with the gracious ease of someone who had decided, privately, that this was simply her due. She looked at Imani across the lobby with the expression of a woman who believed she was the wronged party in a story she had authored. Misuk, Imani said. I wanted to speak with you personally, Misuk said. Her English was careful and precise. She had taken lessons for 20 years. Not through lawyers. All right. What you are doing to my son, what I am doing, Imani said quietly, is protecting myself and my children. You are dismantling everything. I am separating my assets from a marriage that your son ended last night. Imani kept her voice low and her posture open. The lobby had 3 people in it, the reception staff and a waiting client, and she was aware of all of them. I did not create this situation. You are pregnant, Misuk said, as if this were an argument, as if being pregnant should produce a different response in Imani. More pliability, more fear, more willingness to absorb what had been done to her in order to preserve the structure around her. I am, Imani said. 7 months, and I will be making every decision from this point forward based on what is best for my children, all 3 of them. Misuk's chin lifted. My son made a mistake. Your son has been conducting an affair for over a year, using my company's charitable foundation to finance it. Imani's voice did not rise. It dropped, the way a temperature drops before a storm. He has been letting a woman live in my property and telling her it was his. He handed me divorce papers on our anniversary. She paused. I have been paying for your medical treatment for 11 years, Misuk, privately, monthly, out of my own company's accounts, not joint funds. Misuk went very still. I think, Imani said, you came here expecting a certain kind of woman. One who would cry in her office and be frightened about the future and be willing to negotiate to keep the structure intact. She looked at the older woman directly. I understand why you expected that. I built that structure. I made it comfortable. I made everything comfortable. A beat. I'm not going to do that anymore. Misuk opened her mouth. The medical program, Imani said before she could speak. I'll give you 60 days notice in writing. It will come from my attorney. You'll have time to make arrangements. She held Misuk's gaze. I'm sorry that Taejun's decisions have consequences for you, but I didn't make his decisions. She pressed the elevator button. Imani. Misuk's voice had changed. The precision was still there, but something under it had cracked. Something old and frightened. He is my son. I know, Imani said, not unkindly, entirely without apology. And Naomi, Caleb, and Amelia are my children. The elevator opened. Imani stepped in. She rode back up to the 14th floor and walked directly to the bathroom at the end of the hallway and stood at the sink with her hands flat on the counter and breathed. Deliberately, slowly, the way her doctor had shown her during the second trimester when her blood pressure had crept up and she'd had to learn the difference between the stress she could manage and the stress that would cost her something physical. In and out, steady. She looked at herself in the mirror. The pregnancy had changed her face in ways she still caught herself noticing. A fullness at the jaw, shadows under the eyes that were permanent now, not just from nights like last night. She was 37 years old and 7 months along and in the middle of dismantling 12 years all at once, and her hands were not shaking. She found that significant. Her hands were not shaking. She dried them, walked back to the conference room, sat down. Where were we? She said. Marcus looked at her, said nothing about wherever she had just been. Custody structure, he said. Right. She picked up her pen. Let's finish this. They worked through the afternoon. By 3, the auditor had arrived and was set up in the small conference room with access to the foundation's server files. By 4:30, Danielle had pulled every transaction record associated with Taejun's secondary account access going back 22 months, 2 months further than Imani had initially requested, because Danielle always went further than initially requested, which was why Imani had promoted her twice. At 5:15, Danielle knocked on the conference room door where Imani and Marcus were still working. Her face told the story before her words did. There's more, she said. Imani looked up. 22 months back. Danielle set a single printed page on the table. He opened a secondary expenditure line, coded it under consulting fees, quarterly disbursements. She put her finger on a number at the bottom of the page. $312,000. The room went silent. Marcus set down his pen. Imani looked at the number. She read it twice. $312,000, moved in quarterly installments over 22 months through a consulting fee account that bore Taejun's signature authority and a company name she had never seen before, KT Advisory Solutions, that, when Danielle had run the registration search 20 minutes ago, turned out to be a single-member LLC registered in Delaware 18 months before the earliest disbursement. Taejun had set up a shell company and run it through her foundation's books. KT, Imani said slowly. Kang Taejun. That's what I thought too, Danielle said. Imani looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the page. This, he said, is no longer just a divorce. The afternoon light was going flat against the conference room windows. Outside, Seattle was beginning its evening transition, lights coming on in the buildings across the street, the particular dense gray of a Pacific Northwest dusk settling over everything. Imani reached across the table and picked up the page. She read every line. She set it back down. Call the auditor in here. Here, she said, and get me the original foundation and corporation documents. Every page. She looked at Marcus. I want to know how deep this goes before I decide what to do with it. Marcus nodded and reached for his phone. Danielle left to get the auditor. And Imani sat alone in the conference room for 30 seconds, with the page in front of her and the number at the bottom of it, and the slowly solidifying understanding that the man she had married, the man she had protected and financed and carried and loved in the particular complicated way she had always loved him, had not made a mistake in a weak moment with a young woman. He had constructed something, deliberately, over nearly 2 years, using the machinery she had built. The auditor came through the door. Imani straightened in her chair, placed both hands flat on the table, and began. The auditor's name was Raymond Cho, 51, a forensic accountant who had spent the last 19 years untangling other people's financial deceptions for a living. And he had the particular quality of a man who had seen enough human dishonesty that almost nothing registered on his face anymore. Almost nothing. He looked at the KT Advisory Solutions disbursement records for 11 minutes without speaking. Imani had learned not to interrupt people when they were reading something important, so she sat across from him with her hands around a cold cup of coffee and waited. Marcus was beside her, legal pad open, pen held loosely between two fingers. Raymond turned to page 4 of the incorporation documents. Then he looked up. Who else had access to the Foundation's secondary operating account? He asked. Tae-jun, listed as non-executive cultural advisor, Imani said. Myself as founding director. And our previous foundation administrator, a woman named Carol Shen, who left the organization 14 months ago. Raymond set the page down with the deliberate care of someone handling evidence. Carol Shen. Why did she leave? Imani looked at Danielle, who was standing near the window with her arms crossed and her phone in her hand. She resigned, Danielle said. Personal reasons, she said. She gave 30 days' notice. Clean departure. We gave her a reference. Did you conduct an exit interview? Standard questions. Nothing flagged. Raymond turned back to the documents. He put his finger on a line near the bottom of the operating account signatory page. This countersignature. On the KT Advisory Solutions onboarding documentation. He turned the page so Imani could see it. This is not Tae-jun's signature. Imani leaned forward. The signature was neat, looped, entirely distinct from Tae-jun's angular and compressed handwriting. That's Carol's signature, Danielle said from the window. The room was very quiet. Imani looked at the signature. She looked at the date beside it. 23 months ago, 3 weeks before the first quarterly disbursement. 3 weeks before, by Raymond's preliminary timeline, any money had moved. Carol Shen had not simply left. Carol Shen had helped set it up and then walked out cleanly before anyone started counting. I want Carol Shen's complete employment records, Imani said. Her voice was level. It was the levelness of someone who had absorbed too many shocks in too short a time and had reached the place where the nervous system simply stops registering each individual blow and begins treating them as a single sustained condition. Every email, every access log, every foundation document she touched. That will take, Danielle started. Tonight, Imani said, whatever it takes. Danielle nodded once and left the room. Marcus put his pen down on the legal pad and looked at Imani directly. This changes the nature of the legal exposure, significantly. I know. If Carol Shen was a co-architect of this, and if Tae-jun directed her, then it wasn't opportunism, Imani said. It was a plan. Marcus said nothing. Raymond turned another page. Imani stood up from the table. She walked to the window and stood where Danielle had been standing, looking at the Seattle skyline going dark building by building as the evening settled in. Her back ached. It had been aching since morning, the particular low-grade pull of third trimester fatigue that no amount of repositioning entirely relieved. She pressed her palm briefly to the small of her back, adjusted her weight, and stood straight. 23 months ago, Tae-jun had been sitting across from her at their kitchen table in the city, eating dinner, asking about the twins' school schedule, and simultaneously had authorized a shell company to begin drawing from her foundation's accounts. 23 months ago, she had been 35 years old and not yet pregnant with Amelia and still believing, not naively, she had never been naive, but genuinely based on available evidence, that the structure of her marriage, however imperfect, was intact. He had done this while she believed that. She turned back to the room. Raymond, how much more is there? Raymond looked at her steadily. I've been through 18 months of records in 2 hours. To do this right, I need 48 hours minimum and access to the Foundation's full digital archive going back to inception. You have it. If the pattern holds across the full timeline, he stopped, chose his words. 312,000 may be a conservative number. The air in the room shifted. Imani heard her own heartbeat for a moment, clear and steady, the way you hear things when everything around you has gone still. Do the work, she said. All of it. I want the real number. She picked up her phone and called Danielle on the way out of the conference room. I need Carol Shen's last known address and contact information, whatever HR has. Already pulling it, Danielle said. And I need you to check something else. Imani walked down the hallway toward her office, one hand trailing the wall. The Cultural Advisory Board meetings, the ones Tae-jun supposedly attended as non-executive advisor. Check the attendance logs. Check whether he was actually present at any of them. A pause. You think the title was the mechanism? I think someone thought about this carefully, Imani said, and I want to know how carefully. She sat down at her desk. Her office was the corner of the 14th floor, 2 walls of glass. A desk she had picked herself from a craftsman in Portland, bookshelves that held the kind of actual books she actually read, finance, biography, a worn copy of a Toni Morrison novel she'd been rereading in 10-minute increments for 4 months. The space was hers in a way very few spaces had ever been. She sat in the chair she had chosen and looked at the city outside and breathed. Her phone rang. The number was Taejun's. She stared at it for 2 rings. Then she picked up. "Where are you?" he asked. His voice was different from the morning call. The morning had been controlled, precise, the voice of a man managing a situation. This was tighter. Something had reached him. "My office," she said. "You hired a forensic auditor." "I'm protecting my foundation." "Imani." His voice dropped, and in the drop there was something she hadn't heard from him in a very long time. Not anger, not authority, but something closer to fear. "Whatever you think you've found, KT Advisory Solutions," she said. Silence. "Taejun." More silence. The particular silence of a man who has been running a calculation and has just realized the answer has already been found. "That was," he started. "Don't." Her voice was quiet and absolute. "Do not tell me what it was. Not on this call. Not without your attorney present." She paused. "Because if you tell me right now, without counsel, whatever you say becomes something I have to decide what to do with. And I am trying very deliberately to keep my decisions clean and legal and defensible." Another pause. "So don't." She heard him breathe. "Get your attorney on this," she said. "Tonight. Because by morning, my team will have a much clearer picture of what the full scope looks like, and whatever Marcus and your attorney work out in the next 12 hours is going to matter a great deal." She ended the call. She put the phone face down on the desk. She sat with her hands in her lap for a moment, looking at the books on the shelf. The Morrison novel, 3rd shelf from the top, its spine creased and soft from years of being opened. She had first read it at 22. She had given a copy to her mother the same year. She had never met anyone else who had read it and understood it the way she did. Her mother. She hadn't called her mother. She picked up the phone. Patricia Whitaker was 63, a retired high school principal from Atlanta who had raised Imani alone from the age of 8 after a marriage ended the way some marriages end. Not dramatically, not with an envelope across a dinner table, but with a slow withdrawal, a gradual disappearance. A man who one day simply wasn't there anymore and had left nothing behind that covered what he owed. Patricia picked up in 2 rings. "Baby." Just that. One word. Imani's composure, which had held through Marcus and Raymond and Mi-Suk in the lobby, and Taejun on the phone, and 36 hours of no real sleep, cracked along a single clean line. "Mom," she said, and her voice broke. Just once, just for a second, like a branch under exactly the right pressure. And then she pulled it back. "Tell me," Patricia said. Imani told her. All of it. The restaurant, the envelope, Danielle's call, the foundation accounts, Carol Shen's signature, the shell company. She told it the way she processed everything, sequentially, with the relevant details in the right order, without editorializing. Patricia listened without interrupting, which was a skill she had developed over 35 years of parenting and 20 of running a high school. When Imani finished, Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are the children safe?" "Yes." "Are you healthy?" "Yes." "Is the baby healthy?" "Yes." "All right." Patricia's voice was steady and low. "Then everything else is paperwork." Imani almost laughed. It wasn't funny. But the blunt Atlantan practicality of it, everything else is paperwork, hit something in her chest that needed to be hit. "Mom, I'm coming up there," Patricia said. "You don't have to." "Imani Denise Whitaker, you are 7 months pregnant. You are in the middle of a financial fraud investigation. You have 2 children who need steady adults around them, and you are trying to handle all of it yourself because you have always tried to handle everything yourself." A brief pause. "I'm coming up there. I'll be on the first flight I can book." Imani looked at the city outside her office window. "Okay," she said quietly. "Thank you." She got home to the Madrona house at 9:30. Rosie had the children in bed. The house was dark except for the kitchen light and the lamp in the living room. Imani took off her shoes at the door, the way she had always done, and stood in the hallway for a moment just breathing the particular smell of a house where children lived. something like warmth and laundry detergent, and the faint, sweet remnant of whatever Rosie had made for dinner. She went upstairs. She checked Caleb first. He was asleep this time, genuinely, on his side with his arm over the edge of the mattress, in the careless sprawl of a boy who sleeps the way only children sleep, completely, trustingly, without reservation. She pulled his arm back onto the bed and pulled the blanket up and stood over him for a moment in the dark. Then Naomi, also asleep, but on her back, perfectly still, the way she'd slept since infancy, like she was conserving energy, even unconscious. Amani stood in her doorway. Both of them here, both of them safe, both of them asleep in a house that belonged to their mother, in a neighborhood their mother had chosen, under a roof their mother had paid for. Whatever came next, that was true. She went to bed. At 2:40 in the morning, her phone buzzed. She was not fully asleep, had not been fully asleep, and she picked it up immediately. It was a message from Danielle. Found something. Call me when you're up. It's about Carol. Amani called immediately. Danielle answered with the voice of someone who had also not been sleeping. The attendance logs for the advisory board meetings, she said, without preamble. Tejun attended 0 of the 11 meetings held during his advisory tenure. His name is on the minutes because someone logged his proxy attendance. Carol. Carol. A pause. And Amani. The access logs for the Foundation's digital archive. Carol didn't stop accessing the files when she resigned. She had remote credentials. She was still pulling documents for 6 weeks after her last day. Amani sat up in bed. The room was dark. The rain had come back, light against the windows. She was covering tracks, or confirming the transfers were processing correctly. Danielle paused again. And there's one more thing. Her last known address from HR. It's the Belltown studio. The room tilted. Amani sat very still in the dark. Carol Shen's last known address in the HR files was the Belltown studio that had been leased through the Foundation's artist residency account. The studio that Unipark had been living in for 14 months. The studio that Taijun had been paying for through Imani's own charitable foundation. They knew each other, Imani said. That's what it looks like. Carol and Yuna. I can't confirm the nature of it from the records alone, but the address overlap. Pull every record you have on Carol Shen going back to her hire date, Imani said. I want to know how she came to us, who referred her, every external contact she had on company systems. Her voice was entirely flat now, the emotional register stripped down to functional. And get me everything publicly available on Unipark. Education, employment, anything. On it, Danielle said. Are you okay? Go back to sleep, Imani said. A few hours. You'll be more useful rested. She ended the call. She sat in the dark bedroom with the rain on the windows and the baby moving in the slow, searching way of a child who doesn't know what's happening outside and doesn't need to know. And Amani thought, really thought, pulling the shape of it together, about what she was looking at. Carol Shen had been hired as the Foundation's administrator 3 years ago. Amani had hired her. She had interviewed well, her references had checked out, and she had been competent and professional for the first 16 months of her tenure. Then, if the timeline held, something had shifted. A contact had been made, or an existing contact had activated. A plan had been developed, or a plan that already existed had been implemented. Unipark was 25. She was a graduate student. She was, according to what Taejun had told Imani over the restaurant table, someone he had met through the Foundation's cultural programming, which Carol Shen administered. The question was not whether the connection existed. The question was who had been in whose orbit first, and why, and for how long. At 7 a.m., Raymond Cho called. I've been working through the night, he said. He didn't sound tired. He sounded the way forensic accountants sound when they have found something significant, alert, careful, and faintly grim. I need you to come in. How bad? Amani said. The 312,000 was 2 years, he said. The pattern goes back further. Different mechanism. The early disbursements were coded differently, harder to distinguish at a glance. But the structure is the same shell company name, different account routing. How far back? I need another 6 hours to give you a definitive number, Raymond said. But my preliminary estimate, looking at the full archive, is 4 years. 4 years. Amani was standing in her kitchen in bare feet with the morning light coming in gray through the window and her coffee going cold on the counter, and the number settled over her like something physical. 4 years. Naomi and Caleb had been 7. She had been 33. She had not yet been pregnant with Amelia. She had been building the foundation, excited about it, genuinely, the way she was excited about projects that had meaning to her. Arts access, cultural programming, scholarship support for students who wouldn't otherwise have it. She had been pouring herself into something she believed was good, and the machine had already started. "Come in at 9," she said. "I'll be there." She got the children ready for school with the automatic competence of a woman who had been doing this alone for months. Really. Taejun had been present in the house without being present in the mornings, always sleeping later, always somewhere else when the lunches needed packing and the backpacks needed checking. Naomi made her own lunch. Caleb could not find his left sneaker for 6 minutes until Imani found it under the couch, exactly where she had known it would be. She drove them to school herself, which she rarely did when work was full, and she stood at the drop-off curb and watched them go through the doors. Naomi straight-backed and deliberate, Caleb stopping to say something to a friend and laugh, his whole face opening up the way children's faces open when they're briefly, entirely in the present moment. She sat in the car for a moment after the doors closed behind them. Then she drove to the office. Raymond had everything spread across the large conference table when she arrived. Printed records, highlighted pages, a timeline he had constructed on a whiteboard along the back wall. The whiteboard started 4.5 years ago and moved forward in quarterly intervals, each labeled with a dollar amount, a mechanism, and a brief descriptor. Imani stood in front of the whiteboard and read it from left to right. The preliminary total, circled at the end of the timeline in red marker, was $641,000. She read it twice. $641,000 drawn from the Whitaker Cultural Initiative over 4.5 years through a constructed system of fraudulent consulting fees, fabricated vendor accounts, and mislabeled operational expenditures, all bearing signatures that pointed to Taejun's advisory authority and Carol Shen's administrative access. Over 4.5 years, almost the entire life of the foundation she had built because she believed in it. Marcus came through the door at 9:15 with his legal pad and his coffee and stopped when he saw Imani's face. He looked at the whiteboard. His jaw tightened. One precise movement, controlled immediately, the first visible reaction she had ever seen from him in a professional context. "Is this confirmed?" he asked Raymond. "Preliminary. I'd put confidence at 85%. The final number may move slightly either direction, but not significantly." Marcus turned to Imani. "This is no longer a divorce matter." "No," she said. "We're talking about potential wire fraud, charitable fraud, possibly RICO adjacent depending on how his organization interfaces with the shell company." "I know." "Imani." Marcus moved to stand beside her, looking at the whiteboard. "You need to decide something. This goes any further." He turned to look at her directly. "If you take this to the DA, it becomes a criminal matter. It is out of your hands from that point. The divorce, the custody arrangement, the company separation, all of it becomes secondary to a criminal proceeding that could take years and that will affect your children's relationship with their father in ways you cannot fully control once it starts." She looked at the whiteboard. "If you use it as leverage in the divorce and keep it civil, you potentially recover more of the money, protect the foundation's reputation faster, and maintain some control over the outcome." He paused. "But you're also allowing a significant fraud to go without criminal accountability. And if I do nothing?" "That's not an option," Marcus said, not unkindly. "The auditor's findings are going to require legal reporting of some kind. The question is the shape of it." Imani looked at the red circle at the end of the whiteboard timeline. $641,000. Years of her life in that number. Years of work, of sleepless nights, of decisions made carefully and well, so that a foundation she believed in could function and support people who needed it. Students who had received scholarships because she wrote checks, artists who had been awarded grants because she attended grant meetings and sat on program committees and cared about the work. Real people, real impact, funded by money that was simultaneously being drained through a parallel channel into a shell company bearing a man's initials. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. The number was unfamiliar. Seattle area code, not a contact. She nearly didn't answer. Then something made her. Imani Whitaker? The voice was young, female, shaking in the very particular way of someone who has rehearsed a phone call 3 times and is still not ready to make it. Imani's hand tightened around the phone. Speaking. My name is Una Park, the voice said. The conference room was entirely still. I think, Una Park said, that we need to talk, because I found something in the studio before I left. A pause. A breath. The sound of someone who has been crying recently and has tried to stop. Carol left something here. A folder. I didn't understand what it was at first, but I looked at it last night and I think... Her voice broke slightly. I think Tae-jun has been lying to both of us. Imani stood in front of the whiteboard with $641,000 circled in red and the woman her husband had left her for on the phone, and the shape of the thing she was dealing with suddenly, completely, rearranged itself into something larger and colder and more deliberate than anything she had been prepared for. Where are you right now? Imani said. Una Park was staying at a budget hotel in Sodu, the kind of place that charges by the week, and doesn't ask questions, 3 blocks from the train yard, where the sound of freight movement never entirely stopped. Imani got the address and told her to stay there. She told Marcus she'd be back in 90 minutes. He started to object. She picked up her bag and looked at him with an expression that ended the objection before it formed. She had been a black woman in boardrooms for 15 years, and she had developed out of pure necessity a particular look that communicated without ambiguity that the decision had already been made, and the only remaining question was whether the person in front of her wanted to be useful or get out of the way. Marcus handed her his card. Call me if anything shifts. She drove herself. The hotel was a 5-story concrete building with a lobby that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and the specific staleness of recycled air. Imani told the front desk she was visiting a guest, gave Yuna's room number, and rode the elevator to the 3rd floor. She stood outside room 310 for a moment. In the 12 hours since Tae-jun had handed her the envelope at Elara, she had frozen his accounts, confronted his mother, discovered a shell company, learned that the foundation she had built had been systematically drained for 4.5 years, and now she was standing outside a hotel room door about to meet the woman her husband had told her he loved. She knocked. The door opened. Una Park was smaller than Imani had expected. Not in height, they were similar in height, but in presence, in the particular quality of someone who had recently had something knocked out of them and hadn't yet found steady footing. She was 25 and looked it in the undefended way of someone who hasn't yet built the face they'll carry through their 30s. Her eyes were swollen. She was wearing an oversized sweatshirt and holding a manila folder against her chest with both arms, the way a child holds something they've been told is important and don't want to drop. She looked at Imani's belly first, then her face. Come in, Una said. The room was small. 1 bed, a desk, a window that looked out at the building across the alley. On the bed, a single rolling suitcase, partially unpacked. On the desk, a laptop and 2 coffee cups from a fast food place, one of them still steaming. Imani sat in the desk chair. Una sat on the edge of the bed. The folder was still in her hands. I didn't know about the foundation, Una said immediately. Not defensively, like someone who has been rehearsing the sentence for hours and needs to get it out first. He told me the studio was... He said it was a cultural initiative he personally funded through his business holdings. He said he was a patron. He was using my foundation's accounts, Imani said. My charitable organization. My money. Una flinched. It was small and involuntary and genuine. I understand if you don't believe that I didn't know. I don't know yet what I believe, Imani said. Show me the folder. Una held it out. Her hand was not entirely steady. Imani took it and opened it on her lap. The folder contained 11 pages. Some printed, some handwritten. The printed pages appeared to be email correspondence, screenshots, not originals, the kind you take when you don't have direct access to an account, but you can see someone else's screen. The handwritten pages were in a script Imani didn't recognize, compact, angular, organized in a way that suggested a list more than a letter. The email screenshots were between 2 addresses. One was Carol Shen's foundation email, the one that had been deactivated upon her resignation 14 months ago. The other was an address Imani didn't recognize, a personal Gmail account, the username a string of numbers. but the content of the emails made the identity clear within 3 lines. They were discussing disbursement schedules, specific amounts, specific dates, specific account routing numbers, all of it in language just oblique enough that it wouldn't immediately read as incriminating in a casual glance. The kind of careful coded phrasing that people use when they know they're creating a record and want the record to be deniable. The emails spanned 14 months. The last one was dated 6 weeks before Carol Shen submitted her resignation. Imani read every page. Yuna sat on the edge of the bed and watched her read and did not speak. That, Imani noticed, was not nothing. A woman with something to hide would be filling the silence. Yuna was just waiting. When Imani reached the handwritten pages, she paused. They were not in English. She looked up at Yuna. "What language is this?" "Korean." Yuna twisted her hands in her lap. "I studied it for 2 years in undergrad. I can read it. It's a list of properties and what looks like projected valuations." She hesitated. "And your name?" Imani looked back down at the pages. She could not read Korean, but she could see the structure. Numbered lines, columns, figures that were clearly financial. And in the right margin of the 3rd page, in the same angular script, what appeared to be a notation that included a word repeated twice across different lines. "What does this word say?" Imani said, putting her finger beside it. Yuna leaned forward and looked at the page. Her face changed. Something went very careful behind her eyes. "Transfer," she said. "Transfer of what?" The legal terminology, I'm not certain of the exact translation, but the context." She looked at the column of figures beside the word. "It looks like it's projecting the transfer of property holdings." "To whom?" Yuna was quiet. "Yuna." "There's a name at the top of the column," Yuna said. "On page 4, when I first looked at this, I didn't understand what it meant. But," she stopped. "Tell me." "The name is Park Dae-won." Imani did not recognize the name. She looked at Yuna. Yuna looked back at her with the expression of someone who has been carrying a piece of information they didn't choose to have and is now in the process of understanding how much it weighs. "That's my father," Yuna said. The room was so quiet that Imani could hear the freight train moving 3 blocks away, the long, low sound of something massive shifting through the city. She put the folder down on her knee. She looked at Yuna Park, 25 years old, sitting on the edge of a bed in a budget hotel in Sodo, wearing a sweatshirt that was too big for her, holding herself very still. And she recalibrated. She had come into this room expecting to find the woman her husband had chosen over her. Instead, she was looking at a woman who had potentially been used as a mechanism by the same man for an entirely different purpose. "How long have you known Tae-jun?" Imani said. 18 months. I met him at a foundation event." A pause. "He approached me." "Did he know your father before he met you?" Yuna's face shifted. "That's the question I've been sitting with since last night." She looked at her hands. "My father runs a property development company in Vancouver, small to mid-scale. He's been trying to expand his U.S. portfolio for 3 years. She stopped again. "Tae-jun knew that. He mentioned it early on, that he knew of my father's company. I thought it was coincidence." "It wasn't coincidence," Imani said. "No," Yuna said quietly. "I don't think it was." Imani looked at the folder on her knee. She thought about the property valuation lists on the Korean language pages. She thought about the shell company. She thought about 4.5 years of systematic withdrawal from her foundation. She thought about a 23-year-old girl who had shown up at a cultural foundation event and met a powerful man who told her she was extraordinary. She thought about how a plan like this was constructed. You needed access to the money, Carol Shen, an inside administrator with account authority. You needed a legitimate vehicle, the foundation, already established, already credible. You needed a destination for the extracted funds, KT Advisory Solutions, a shell company. And you needed a reason for the foundation to maintain its relationship with Tae-jun, to keep his advisory title active, to ensure no one looked too closely at the accounts. A reason that would also provide personal cover, a personal narrative, a love story. A man falling for a young woman through his wife's own charitable organization. A scandal so personally consuming that anyone investigating the finances would be distracted by the obvious personal wrongdoing and miss the structural fraud underneath it. Amani sat with that in her chest for exactly 5 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called Marcus. I need you to research a property developer, she said when he picked up. Vancouver-based. Name is Park Dae-won. A pause. She could hear Marcus writing. Connection? Yuna Park is his daughter. A longer pause. I'll have something in an hour, Marcus said, and the steadiness of his voice told her he understood the implication without needing it spelled out. She ended the call. She looked at Yuna. I need to ask you something different, Amani said. Yuna met her gaze. Did your father know about your relationship with Tae-jun? Yes, Yuna stopped. Her jaw tightened, the expression of someone pushing through something. He was pleased. He said Tae-jun was a good connection. He said the relationship could be beneficial. She looked at her own hands. I thought he meant personally, that he wanted me to be happy. She swallowed. I'm 25. I thought my father was happy for me. When did you last speak to him? Yesterday morning, before I got the notice about the studio. She looked up. He called me, before I even knew about the eviction. He told me not to panic if I heard anything about Tae-jun and a legal dispute. He said it would resolve itself. The freight train sound faded. The room was entirely still. Amani stood up. She felt the weight of the pregnancy differently when she stood from a low position. The shift of gravity, the particular physical renegotiation of a body carrying extra mass. She steadied herself once against the desk edge, the automatic steadying of a woman in her third trimester, and then stood straight. I need to take this folder, she said. I know, Yuna said. And I may need you to make a statement, legally, about the timeline of your relationship, your father's involvement, and how this folder came to be in the studio. She looked at Yuna directly. That will be difficult. I know that too. You should get your own attorney before you do anything, Amani said. Not Tae-jun's, not your father's, your own. Yuna nodded slowly. Will you? She stopped, started again. I'm sorry. I know I don't have standing to ask you anything, but will you tell me, do you think he ever… Her voice broke slightly. She held it. Was any of it real? With me? Amani looked at her. She thought about Tae-jun's voice on the restaurant phone call, the particular rawness in it when he'd said she didn't know. The way he'd said it, not as a defense of himself, but as a defense of Yuna. Whether that meant anything real or whether it was simply the instinct of a man who needed to believe his own story, Amani couldn't say. I don't know, she said, and I think that's the truest answer I can give you. Yuna nodded. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. That's fair. Amani picked up the folder in her bag. She paused at the door. Find an attorney today, she said. Don't talk to Tae-jun until you have one. She left. She sat in her car in the hotel parking lot for 4 minutes with the folder on the passenger seat and both hands on the wheel and the engine not running. Then she started the car and drove. The call from Marcus came at 11:53 when she was back in the 14th floor conference room with Raymond and the whiteboard and the color-coded timeline. He spoke for 6 minutes. Amani listened and did not interrupt. Park Dae-won's development company, Pacific Rim Properties, Inc., had been in active contract negotiations with 3 Seattle-area commercial real estate entities for the past 8 months. 2 of those entities were holding companies. Both holding companies, when you traced the corporate registration tree far enough, had Tae-jun's name or the names of his known associates somewhere in the middle layers. There was also this. Park Dae-won had wired $200,000 to a business account in the Cayman Islands 11 months ago. The receiving account had the same routing structure, not the same number, but the same structure, as the KT Advisory Solutions disbursement account. He's not just Yuna's father, Marcus said. He's a co-investor, or was positioned to be. Tae-jun was moving money out of my foundation, Amani said, slowly, and using it to build a property investment vehicle to cut deals with Yuna's father. That's what the paper trail suggests. And the relationship with Yuna was cover, leverage, possibly genuine on some level, I can't tell you that. But functionally, she was the link between Tae-jun and Park Dae-won that made the investment relationship personal and deniable. Imani thought about the handwritten Korean pages, the property valuations, her name in the margin. Why is my name in the Korean documents? She said. Marcus paused. That's the question I'd like Raymond to look at next. But my suspicion, and it's only a suspicion right now, is that some of those property projections involve assets held under your name or your company's name. The back of Imani's neck went cold. He was planning to move assets I own, she said. I think the original plan was more ambitious than what we've found so far, Marcus said carefully. I think the foundation drainage was phase 1. I think the divorce... He stopped. Say it, Imani said. I think the divorce may have been intended to trigger asset division proceedings that would have given Tae-jun legal access to property valuations and disclosures he didn't currently have. And I think he intended to use that information, combined with Park Dae-won's capital, to make moves on real estate that he could not access any other way. Imani sat down. She sat down in the conference room chair with the whiteboard in front of her and the folder from Yuna's studio on the table and Marcus's voice in her ear, and she did not say anything for a long moment. The divorce was not an exit. It was a mechanism. He had not fallen in love and decided to leave. He had constructed a financial strategy, and the love story was the narrative architecture that made the mechanism work. The envelope across the dinner table at Ilara. The anniversary timing. The pregnant wife. All of it designed, consciously or not, to produce a specific legal and financial outcome. Except she had frozen the accounts on the same night. Except she had called Danielle before she left the restaurant. Except she had moved faster than he had planned for. Marcus, she said. I'm here. Get me into a room with Tae-jun today, with his attorney present, with you present, and with Raymond's preliminary findings on the table. Her voice had no heat in it. It had something harder than heat. Because I want to watch him understand exactly what I know before he has time to build a new story around it. A pause. Are you certain that's how you want to play this? He sat across from me last night, Imani said, and handed me an envelope, and I was 7 months pregnant, and he thought I would be too frightened or too heartbroken to look at the mechanics of what was underneath it. She picked up her pen. I want him to understand what he miscalculated. I'll call his attorney, Marcus said. The meeting was set for 4 p.m. at Marcus's office on 5th Avenue. Tae-jun arrived with his attorney, a Korean-American man named James Rowe, who was sharp and precise and had the contained energy of someone who had spent the last 18 hours being given incomplete information by his client and had pieced together enough to know the situation was significantly worse than presented. Imani arrived with Marcus and Raymond's preliminary report, printed, bound, tabbed with color-coded markers. She arrived first. She was sitting at the conference table when Tae-jun walked in. He looked at her, and she looked at him. And the room held that for a moment. Two people who had shared 12 years and 2 children and an unborn daughter, and a set of financial decisions that had turned out to be something entirely different from what one of them believed they were. Tae-jun looked tired, not the tired of a sleepless night. He'd had those, she'd seen that, but the tired of a man who has been running a particular version of events in his head and has begun to suspect it's the wrong version. He sat down across from her. James Rowe sat beside him, set a leather folder on the table, and looked at Marcus with the professional wariness of opposing counsel who already knows the other side has more ammunition. Marcus placed the bound report in the center of the table. We'll let the documentation speak first, Marcus said. James Rowe opened the report. He read the first 2 pages. His face did not move, but his hand tightened on the cover of his own folder with the small, involuntary grip of a man absorbing bad information. Tae-jun looked at the report and then at Imani. Imani, he said. Listen to your attorney, she said. Not unkindly, simply. Rowe kept reading. It took 9 minutes for him to get through the substantive sections. When he finished, he set the report down and looked at his client with an expression that Imani recognized. The expression of a professional who has just confirmed that their client has been less than fully transparent. Tae-jun, Rowe said quietly. I need a few minutes with my client. Of course, Marcus said. Imani and Marcus stepped into the hallway. She leaned against the wall and breathed. Her back was aching again, the low, persistent ache that had been with her all day. She put her hand to it briefly, pressed, released. You're doing well, Marcus said. I'm holding it together, she said. They're different things. Both count, he said. She almost said something, then stopped. They went back in when Rowe opened the door. Tae-jun was sitting differently than before. The posture had changed, not collapsed. He was not a man who collapsed, But something in the architecture of how he held himself had been adjusted. He looked at Imani with the first genuinely direct look he had given her since the restaurant. "How much do you know?" he said. "Read the report," Marcus said. "I'm asking her." Imani looked at him. "I know about KT Advisory Solutions. I know about Carol Shen. I know about the 4.5 years and the preliminary $641,000 figure, which Raymond believes may increase as he works through the earlier records." She paused. "I know about Park Day-won." Taejun's jaw moved, that muscle working at the hinge. "And I know," she continued, "that the divorce proceeding was structured to create access to asset disclosures you did not otherwise have." Roe put his hand briefly on his client's arm. A lawyer's instinct. Not now. Taejun shook it off. "It wasn't. The divorce wasn't only that. I didn't say it was only that. Yuna." He stopped. "Yuna called me this morning," Imani said. "She had Carol's folder." Whatever Taejun had been about to say dissolved before it reached his mouth. He looked at Imani with the expression of a man who has just watched the last piece of his architecture fall. "She didn't know," he said. And this time the rawness in it was fully audible, so not strategy, not narrative, just a man who had done something with enormous consequences and was sitting in the debris of it. "I believe that," Imani said. "I also believe your relationship with her was never entirely separate from your relationship with her father's money. That's—" He stopped himself. "Which one is the lie, Taejun?" she said, and her voice was very quiet. "Tell me which piece of this wasn't calculated." He looked at the table. The silence stretched. "It started as a contact," he said, finally. Roe made a sharp sound of objection. Taejun ignored it. "Daewon and I were introduced through a mutual associate 3 years ago. The investment structure, the plan, that came first." He stopped. His hands were flat on the table. "But Yuna, I didn't. That wasn't part of the original." "When did it become useful?" Imani said. He looked up at her. His eyes were red at the rims, which she had not noticed until this moment. "About a year in." "So you took something real and made it functional." He didn't answer. "And you took something I built," she said, "something I believed in, and ran a pipeline through it for 4.5 years. Her voice did not crack. It went lower instead, the way a foundation goes lower into the ground when the weight above it increases. "And you sat across from me at dinners and drove the children to school and slept in our house and knew what was underneath it the whole time." The conference room was entirely silent. Taejun looked at his wife, the woman who had built the machine he had used against her, and something in his face did a thing that Imani had not seen in 12 years of marriage. It crumbled. Not a lot. Not dramatically. Just at the corners, just for a moment, like a wall that has been struck and reveals, in a single location, that it is not as solid as it appeared. "I know," he said. "That's all you have," she said. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to understand what this costs you." She opened her own folder, the one Marcus had prepared, and placed a single document in front of James Rowe. Full separation of all Whitaker Holdings assets from any entity connected to Taejun Kang or his associates. Full restitution to the foundation, the final audited amount, whatever Raymond confirms. Primary custody of the children with me, the custody terms Marcus has already outlined. And complete cooperation with the foundation's external audit, including any statements required about Carol Shen's role and Park Dae-won's involvement. "If he cooperates with the audit," Rowe said carefully, "depending on the scope of findings, he may be creating exposure for himself in—" "I'm aware," Imani said. "His cooperation now determines what I do with what I already have." She looked at Taejun. "I have not called the district attorney. I have not gone to the press. I have not contacted any of his business associates." She paused. "Yet." The word sat in the room. Rowe leaned toward his client and said something very quietly in his ear. Taejun's face moved through several things: pride, anger, something that might have been relief, and then the particular expression of a man who has run out of better options. "Give us until tomorrow morning," Rowe said. "You have until 8 a.m., Marcus said. The meeting ended. In the elevator down, Marcus was quiet for 2 floors, and then said, "That was one of the more controlled things I've ever seen someone do in a room like that. I've been practicing composure for 12 years. Amani said. The elevator opened. She walked across the lobby of Marcus's building and through the glass doors into the Seattle afternoon, and the air hit her face, cold, carrying the particular smell of rain that had already fallen and pavement that was already wet. And she stopped on the sidewalk and stood there for a moment. Her phone buzzed. Danielle. She looked at the message. Raymond's done. Final number. $714,000. She read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket. She stood on the sidewalk outside Marcus Webb's office building at 4:50 in the afternoon on the day after her 12th wedding anniversary, and she breathed in the cold Seattle air, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was standing in. Not the anger, not the strategy, just the raw human weight of having loved someone for 12 years, and discovering that alongside that love, running parallel to it the entire time, there had been this. The baby moved. That slow, rolling assertion. Amelia, repositioning. Amani put her hand over the movement. I know, she said quietly, to the sidewalk, to the cold air, to the weight of everything. Then she squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked to her car. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Imani was at the Madrona House kitchen table with coffee and her laptop when her phone rang. It was James Rowe. Taejun would agree to all terms, Rowe said, with 2 modifications to the custody language that Marcus had anticipated and already had counterproposals for. The restitution amount, $714,000, the final audited figure, would be structured as a payment schedule over 24 months, with the first payment due within 30 days and assets pledged as collateral. He would cooperate fully with the foundation audit. He would provide whatever statements were required regarding Carol Shen. He would not contest the asset separation. In exchange, Imani would not pursue criminal referral for the fraud, provided the cooperation was complete and the payment schedule was maintained without default. Marcus will need that in writing by noon, Imani said. It will be there by 10, Rose said. She ended the call. She looked at the kitchen. The morning light was coming in at a low angle, the particular early autumn light that arrived in Seattle like something apologetic, as if the sky knew it owed the city a better summer. Caleb's left sneaker was on the floor by the door, which meant the right one was probably under the couch, and she would need to locate it before school. She got up and looked under the couch. There it was. She picked it up and set it beside its pair and stood in her kitchen in the house she had bought in her own name when she was 26 years old, making breakfast in a life that was going to be fundamentally different from this point forward. And she understood, not as a comfort, not as a resolution, but simply as a fact, that different was not the same as destroyed. At 7:20, Caleb came downstairs with his hair flattened on one side and his eyes still half closed, and he looked at both his sneakers beside the door and then at his mother and said, with the particular economy of a tired 11-year-old, "You found it." "It was under the couch," she said. "It's always under the couch," he said, and sat down at the table, and she put a plate in front of him, and the morning moved forward. Naomi came down 7 minutes later, brayed slightly better today, and sat across from her brother and looked at her mother with those clear, too perceptive eyes. "You look different," Naomi said. Imani looked at her daughter. "Different how?" Naomi considered. "Less like you're holding something," she said. "Like you put something down." Imani looked at her 11-year-old daughter. "Yeah," she said, "something like that." She poured Naomi's orange juice and turned back to the stove, and outside the Seattle morning continued its gray and ordinary business, indifferent and reliable, and somewhere across the city in a hotel room. Unipark was probably calling an attorney, and in whatever space Taejun was occupying, James Rowe was probably walking him through the finalized terms. And in the Whitaker Holdings conference room, Raymond Cho was probably writing up his final audit report. And all of it was in motion, all of it was already happening. And in the kitchen of the Madrona House, Imani Whitaker was making breakfast for her children on an ordinary Thursday morning, and the ground beneath her feet was entirely, irrevocably, for the first time in a very long time, her own. The signed agreement arrived at Marcus Webb's office at 9:54 in the morning, 14 minutes before the deadline Imani had set, and Marcus called her the moment it landed on his desk. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the Madrona House with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, wearing the same sweater she'd put on 2 days ago, and when her phone rang, she picked it up on the first ring because she had been awake since 4:30 and there was no pretending otherwise. Marcus read her the key provisions in sequence, the way he read everything, methodically, without editorializing, letting the language carry its own weight, and trusting her to carry herself through it. Full asset separation. $714,000 in structured restitution, payment schedule over 24 months, first payment due within 30 days, assets pledged as collateral to guarantee performance. Primary physical custody with Imani. Liberal visitation with defined terms. No overnight contact at any residence where Unipark was present until the children's therapist, to be selected within 2 weeks, provided written clearance. Full cooperation with the foundation audit and any external review of Carol Shen's role in Park Dae-won's financial involvement. Complete termination of Tai-jun's advisory title and all related signatory authority, retroactive to the date of the original anniversary dinner. Imani listened to every word without interrupting. When Marcus finished, she asked, "Is it clean?" "It's clean," he said. "Ro did good work with the language. Taejun's signature is on every page, initialed every section." She looked at the kitchen table, at the grain of the wood, the particular worn patch at the corner where Caleb sat, the ring from a coffee cup she'd never gotten around to treating, a table in a house she'd bought herself, a life she'd built herself, a marriage she had financed, in ways she was still discovering the full dimensions of, and which was now, on paper, over. "Imani," Marcus said carefully, "this is a significant outcome. Given where we were 72 hours ago, I want you to hear that." "I hear you," she said. "Thank you, genuinely." "Get some rest," he said. "Real rest. The next phase will require you functional." "I know," she said. She put the phone down and sat with the quiet kitchen for a long time. She had expected to feel something decisive when it was done, something that arrived with edges and weight, something she could name and place. Instead, there was just the gray October morning coming through the window and the sound of the Madrona house settling, and the low, persistent ache in her lower back that had been with her for 3 days, and the awareness that the agreement sitting on Marcus's desk was the end of one chapter, but not the opening line of the next, and that the space between those two things was going to require a different kind of endurance than the crisis had. The crisis had required speed. It had required precision and composure and the ability to receive enormous information without collapsing under it. She had been good at that. She had been, it turned out, very good at that, which was both a relief and its own kind of sad. The discovery that you are built for emergency is not entirely a comfortable one. What came next would require something slower. She was going to have to learn to be slow again. Her mother's flight landed at 11:40. Patricia Whitaker came through the arrivals gate at SeaTac, pulling a single carry-on with the efficiency of a woman who has traveled enough to know that checked luggage is just optimism made expensive. She wore her good navy coat and low heels, and the expression she had worn at every crisis of Imani's adult life. Not alarm, not pity, just complete and unperformative presence, the face of a woman who had arrived and intended to be useful. She saw Imani at the barrier and walked directly to her. She put both arms around her daughter, careful of the belly, and held on. Imani pressed her face against her mother's shoulder. The coat smelled of the Atlanta house, a particular layering of Patricia's soap and the cedar closet, and something indefinable that was simply home in the most molecular sense. Imani was 38 weeks pregnant and had not slept properly in 4 days and had dismantled 12 years of marriage and uncovered a fraud and sat across a conference room table from the man who built it and watched him sign his name to the consequences, and she stood in the SeaTac arrivals hall and held on to her mother for exactly as long as she needed to. She did not cry. She had been precise about that. Not because crying was wrong or weak. She had cried in the Madrona bathroom twice, alone, with the water running, but because she had decided that the crying was for private, and the public version of herself needed to stay functional for a few more weeks while everything settled. After Amelia came, after the court hearing, after the children were established with their therapist, after she had handed off enough of the acute load that falling apart for a day wouldn't cost anyone else anything, then she would do it properly. In the car, Patricia asked nothing about the legal details. She asked about Naomi's sleep, about whether Caleb was still eating enough. He went thin when stressed, had done since he was 4, about what Imani's last blood pressure reading had been. When Imani said she'd had half a sandwich at 2 p.m. the previous day and coffee this morning and hadn't thought much about food because there hadn't been space for it, Patricia said absolutely not, with the particular Atlantan flatness of a woman who considers adequate nutrition a form of personal responsibility and will not be argued with. And she directed Amani to a drive-thru on I-5 and sat in the passenger seat watching her daughter eat with the focused attention of someone checking a task off a list. It was the most ordinary 20 minutes Amani had experienced in 4 days, and the ordinariness of it was so acute that it almost broke her. They said nothing meaningful during the drive, just the radio, low, and the sound of the city, and Patricia's occasional observation about the traffic pattern, or the way Seattle looked different from Atlanta in October, the particular quality of the light. Small observations. The conversation of people who don't need to fill silence to feel connected. When they pulled up to the Madrona house, Patricia got out and looked at it for a moment. The exterior, the garden, the particular way the house sat on its lot, set back and settled and entirely itself. "This is a good house," she said. "I know," Amani said. "You've always had good instincts about what to hold on to." Amani looked at the house, thought about 26 years old and the decision to buy it, the very specific determination behind that decision, the things she had known about herself then that she had spent pieces of the intervening years forgetting. "Come inside," she said. "The kids get home at 3. The family court hearing was 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in November, with rain on the courthouse windows in the way of Seattle in that month. Not dramatic rain, just the steady and committed kind that falls as if it doesn't intend to stop and isn't particularly interested in your schedule. Amani wore a charcoal wool dress and black boots with a modest heel. She was 38 weeks pregnant and had developed the particular walk of a woman in the final stretch. Deliberate, slightly wide-based, each step considered. And she moved through the courthouse lobby with the composed unhurriedness of someone who has accepted that their body is currently operating on its own timeline and has made peace with that. Danielle was in the gallery. Patricia was at home with Naomi and Caleb, who were in school, because Imani had decided that the courthouse was not a place she wanted her children, not for this, not for the procedural finalizing of something that had already been decided in harder rooms under worse circumstances. Marcus was beside her at the plaintiff's table, his legal pad open, his pen in his hand, his presence steady and entirely unremarkable in the way that very good professionals are unremarkable. They don't draw attention to themselves, they direct attention to what matters. Tejun came in with James Rowe, who was wearing a dark suit Imani didn't recognize. Not the charcoal from Alara, not the navy she'd had altered at Parks on 5th, something older, something that fit slightly differently than it had when it was bought, as if the man inside it had rearranged himself somewhat in the weeks since everything collapsed. He sat at the opposing table and Rowe laid his folder open, and for a moment the room was just 2 tables and 4 people, and the rain outside and the particular charged stillness of a formal proceeding that everyone in the room knows is a formality. Tejun looked at her once when he sat down. She looked back, briefly, directly, without message. Then both of them turned to face the bench. The judge reviewed the signed agreement. She asked 3 clarifying questions about the custody schedule, one about the restitution payment structure, one about the foundation's governance changes. Marcus answered all of them cleanly and completely, the way he answered everything. The judge looked over her reading glasses at both tables. Both parties confirm this agreement is entered into voluntarily and without coercion? Yes, Your Honor, Marcus said. Yes, Your Honor, Rowe said. The judge signed. 11 minutes, 12 years of marriage, 2 children born and raised, a 3rd child, 8 weeks from delivery, 4.5 years of fraud layered underneath it all, like a foundation built on the wrong material. 11 minutes in a courtroom to make it official. Imani had prepared herself for the 11 minutes to feel like something. They felt like 11 minutes. In the courthouse hallway after, she was pulling on her coat with Danielle steadying the sleeve. The geometry of late pregnancy in a heavy wool coat required coordination that she didn't entirely have alone anymore. When she heard Rowe's voice behind her, and then a brief exchange, and then footsteps. She turned. Taejun was walking toward her. Alone. Rowe had stayed back, a lawyer's instinct about when to be absent. He stopped 4 feet away. The hallway was marble-floored and high-ceilinged, and his footsteps had echoed on the way over, and now he stood in front of her and the echo was gone, and there was just the 2 of them and the distance between them. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the conference room table, directly, with the full weight of it, not managing the look or performing it, just landing it. "I'm not going to ask for anything," he said. His voice was quiet. The courthouse acoustics made it quieter. I know I don't. I know there's nothing I can ask for right now that would be appropriate. He stopped. His jaw worked once. But the children. I want you to know that I'm going to do better. I know you mean that, she said. I do. Taejun. She shifted her weight, adjusting, the baby sitting low now. The physical reality of the final week, something she was in constant negotiation with. Meaning it in a courthouse hallway is the easy part. The hard part is meaning it at 8 p.m. on a Wednesday when Caleb is being difficult and you're tired, and it would be simpler to just not show up. She held his gaze. That's when it counts. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. Naomi is watching you, she said. She watches everything. She'll know the difference between the version of you that's trying and the version that's performing trying. She paused. So will Caleb, eventually. He's more like you than either of you know, which means he'll forgive you faster and resent you longer when you disappoint him. Something in Taejun's face shifted at that. The specific, painful shift of a parent receiving an accurate description of their child that costs something to hear. And Amelia, Amani continued, won't have any memory of this, which means everything she knows about her father, she'll learn from watching what he does. She let that sit for a second. That's actually the cleanest slate you've been given in this whole thing. Try not to waste it. He was very still. I won't, he said. She looked at him, the father of her 3 children, the man she had loved in the particular flawed and genuine way she had loved him, the man who had sat across from her at Alara, with an envelope and started something he had not fully calculated the cost of. She looked at him and found that the thing she felt was not hatred, had never really been hatred, which surprised her, or maybe didn't, and was not love in the way it had once been, and was not indifference, because indifference requires a kind of distance she was never going to have from the father of her children. What it was, she thought, was something like a cold, clear river, not warm, not frozen, just moving, continuous, indifferent to weather, doing what it does. Take care of yourself, she said, for their sake, if not your own. She turned and walked to the elevator with Danielle. She did not look back. Amelia Iris Whitaker Kong was born on a Thursday morning in late November at 6:47 a.m. after 14 hours of labor that Imani would later describe to her mother as the most physically demanding experience of her adult life, which said something, given what her adult life had contained. Patricia was in the room, not speaking much, not hovering, just present, handing ice chips, squeezing Imani's hand at the relevant moments, existing as the particular kind of company that doesn't require management. The medical team was competent and careful, and there were 2 points during the night where Imani's blood pressure rose enough that the room got quieter and everyone's attention sharpened, and Imani breathed through both of them with the deliberate focus of a woman who has learned in recent months the critical difference between the anxiety she can control and the anxiety that will cost her something physical. The baby came with the dawn. The particular way Amelia entered the world was consistent with everything she would later demonstrate about her character. Completely committed, extremely loud about her preferences, and entirely convinced that the world should reorganize itself to acknowledge her arrival. The cry she produced was immediate and unambiguous, and the midwife said, "Well, that one's got something to say." And Patricia laughed. And Imani, still in the hard aftermath of delivery, breathed out a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite a sob, and was mostly just the physical release of someone who has been holding something enormous for a very long time and has finally been allowed to put it down. They put Amelia on her chest. Imani looked at her daughter. She had Taejun's dark hair, fine and damp, lying flat against her head. She had the shape of Imani's eyes, the particular wide-set directness of the Whitaker women, something that showed up in Patricia and in Patricia's mother, and apparently now in this small, furious person who had arrived in the world with her fist pressed to her cheek, as if she was already deep in thought about something important. "Hey," Imani said, very quietly, to the top of her daughter's damp head. "Hey, I've been waiting to meet you." Amelia's face scrunched in the direction of her voice. "Yeah," Imani said. "I know. It's a lot." Taejun learned about the birth through the family communication channel, the shared messaging thread administered by Rosie, used only for child-related matters, the clean structural solution that had been working for 2 months now, removing the need for either of them to decide in real time whether reaching out was appropriate. The message was simple. Amelia born 6:47 a.m. Thursday. Mother and baby both healthy and well. 6 syllables 11 OZ. He responded in 4 minutes. Thank you for telling me. Tell her she did well. Amani read that in the hospital bed 2 hours post-delivery with Amelia on her chest, and the particular hollow, floating exhaustion of a body that has completed something enormous and is now waiting to understand what normal feels like again. She read the message twice. She noted that he had said, tell her she did well, not tell me when I can come, or I'm on my way, or any of the dozen things the previous version of Taijun would have said with the automatic assumption of access. He had asked nothing. He had simply acknowledged. She handed the phone back to Patricia without responding and looked at Amelia and decided that was enough for today. He came to the hospital the following afternoon during the visiting window Rosie had coordinated. He came alone. No associates, no bodyguard who'd been with him for years, and who Amani had always found slightly unnerving, no elaborate gift in a bag from a store that required a waiting list to enter. He came through the hospital hallway in a jacket that looked like something he'd bought off a regular rack in a regular store, and his hair was slightly shorter, and he looked, Amani thought, like a man who was in the process of figuring out a smaller version of himself and hadn't entirely finished the work. He stopped at the bassinet. Amelia was asleep with the total physical commitment of a newborn, mouth slightly open, both arms flung wide, completely absent from the world, in the particular trusting way of someone who has not yet learned that there are things worth staying alert for. Her chest rose and fell. A lock of dark hair had dried into a curve above her left ear. Taejun stood at the bassinet and looked at his daughter. He looked at her for a long time. Imani watched him from the chair by the window. She was tired in every layer, muscle, bone, the specific cellular exhaustion of a body 48 hours past delivery, and had no energy for any kind of performance, which meant she was just watching. No interpretation, no management, just observing what was actually there. What was there was a man looking at his daughter without any architecture around it. No strategy, no calculation, no performance for an audience. His face was just open. Undone in the small, specific way that people are undone by something they didn't prepare for, something that arrived at a register they hadn't known to protect. His shoulders dropped. Not a lot, just enough. She looks like you, he said, without turning from the bassinet. She looks like herself, Amani said. She'll look like herself for the rest of her life. Let her have that from the beginning. He turned and looked at her then. The same direct look from the courthouse hallway, unguarded, carrying its own weight. How are you? Tired. You should sleep. I will. He looked back at Amelia. He stopped, started again. She's very small. She's 6 pounds 11 ounces, Imani said, which is a perfectly reasonable size for a newborn. Caleb was 8 too, he said. I remember. The hospital room was quiet. The ventilation hummed. From somewhere down the hall, someone's monitor beeped a slow and steady rhythm. Outside the window, November Seattle was doing what November Seattle does, refusing to commit to actual darkness at 5 p.m., just letting everything go the color of an old bruise and staying there. I'm sorry, Taejun said, not looking at her when he said it, still looking at Amelia, as if he needed the baby to anchor him to the room while he said the thing he'd been carrying. I know I've said it, he continued. I know the word doesn't, I know what it doesn't fix. He was quiet for a moment. But I need you to know that when I think about what I actually did, not the legal part, not the money. He stopped. His jaw worked. The part where I sat at your table and ate your food and let you believe that you were... He couldn't finish the sentence. That I was building something real, Imani said. Yes. She let the words sit. I know you're sorry, she said at last. I think the part of you that loves those children really loves them, not the version of love that's about what they reflect back at you. That part of you has been sorry for longer than you admitted. She looked at Amelia's rising chest, the small, perfect rhythm of it. The rest of you just caught up. He didn't answer. I'm not going to carry your guilt for you, she said. That's yours. What you do with it is yours. She shifted in the chair, adjusted her weight. But I will tell you this. The children are watching you learn to be accountable. And if you can actually do it, if you can hold the weight of what you did without deflecting or minimizing or eventually rewriting the story to make yourself more sympathetic, That will be the most valuable thing you ever show them." She paused. "More valuable than anything you could have given them with money." He looked at her then. His eyes were red at the corners, which she had not registered clearly before this moment. "I don't know how to do that," he said. I don't know how to hold something that size without—" He stopped. "Without making it someone else's problem," she said, not unkindly. "I know. That's the work, Tai-jun. That's what the next years look like. And nobody can do it for you." He nodded. A slow, weighted movement. He stayed 20 minutes. He asked if he could hold Amelia, and Amani said not yet. She said it without explanation, and he accepted it without argument, and that acceptance was itself something she filed away. When he left, he paused at the door with his hand on the frame and looked back at the bassinet for a moment. "I'll be at the custody schedule visitation," he said. "Everyone." "Good," she said. The door closed behind him. Patricia, who had been sitting in the hallway with the focused patience of a woman who has lived long enough to know when rooms need privacy, came back in 30 seconds after the elevator doors closed. She settled into the chair beside the bassinet and looked at her granddaughter and didn't say anything for a moment, and then said, "He looked different." "He's smaller," Amani said. Patricia looked at her. "Is that good or bad?" "It's accurate," Imani said. "I don't have a verdict yet on the rest." The Carol Sheen investigation resolved over the winter. Raymond Cho's complete audit report, submitted in mid-December, with the thoroughness that 19 years of forensic work produces, documented every layer of the mechanism with a precision that left nothing ambiguous. Carol Shen had been approached through an intermediary connected to one of Tai-jun's import associates approximately 4 months into her tenure at the foundation, early enough that the approach had likely been planned before she was even hired, which meant the job interview had itself been a form of placement. She had been paid $62,000 for her role, disbursed in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic review, disguised in the foundation's vendor records as recurring IT service fees from a company that, when investigated, turned out to have no employees, no physical address, and no documented service history with any other client. She had been professional, meticulous, and deliberate about every part of it. When the district attorney's office contacted her in January, she had already retained counsel and declined to cooperate. Imani was not surprised. She had not been counting on Carol Shen's cooperation. She had provided the documentation because it was the right thing to do with it, and she had then removed the matter from the space in her mind where she kept things that required her active attention. The DA's office would do what the DA's office would do. Park Dae-won, whose Vancouver dealings intersected with additional financial irregularities that emerged when Marcus coordinated with Canadian counsel, was subject to proceedings that would take years and that were, by the end of January, entirely outside Imani's involvement. She had handed it over. She had learned in the previous months to identify the things that were hers to carry and the things that were not, and to put the second category down with the same deliberateness she had once applied to picking everything up. Tai-jun's first restitution payment arrived on the date specified in the agreement. The second arrived on time as well. He was not performing the payments. There were no accompanying messages, no attempts to reframe them as generosity, no communication at all beyond what the coordination line required. The money arrived, and Raymond confirmed it, and it went into the foundation's replenishment account, and Imani noted it and moved on. Naomi and Caleb had their first session with Dr. Olena Marsh on a Monday in late November, 2 weeks after Amelia was born, when Imani was still in the heavy, early newborn fog of waking every 2 hours and learning a new person's rhythms simultaneously. She had booked the appointment before Amelia arrived, in the first week after the restaurant, because she had decided that her children's access to professional support was not contingent on any other outcome and would not wait for anything to resolve. Dr. Marsh saw them separately for the first month and then together, and then in a rotating combination based on what each of them needed in a given week. Naomi talked about anger, according to what Dr. Marsh shared in parent sessions. She talked about it directly and at length, with the vocabulary of a girl who reads too much and feels too precisely. She was angry at her father for the obvious reasons, and angry at her mother for less obvious ones. The anger of a child who has constructed a parent as a fixed point and discovered the fixed point was actually a person, capable of having been deceived, capable of having been less than she appeared, capable of suffering. Naomi found her mother's vulnerability more destabilizing than her father's betrayal, because she had expected better of the one and had expected less of the other, and the discovery that expectations are their own kind of fragile territory was a thing she needed months to work through. Caleb talked less directly. He built his processing around hypotheticals and sports metaphors and third-person narratives about kids he claimed to know whose parents were getting divorced, and Dr. Marsh allowed all of it because she was good at her job and understood that indirection was still movement, and that Caleb was processing, just in the way he processed everything, through motion, through the exterior world, through the body rather than the mind. By March, both of them were steadier, not resolved, not finished, but steadier in the way that people are steadier when they've stopped waiting for the floor to fall out again and have started learning to live on the current ground, whatever it is. Naomi started a journalism club at school. She became its editor within 6 weeks through a combination of genuine skill and the particular relentless organizational authority of a girl who has watched her mother run companies her entire conscious life and absorbed more than she knew. Caleb joined a community basketball league that practiced Saturday mornings in a gymnasium that smelled of old sneakers and industrial floor wax. And he took it with a seriousness that both alarmed and moved Imani, the focused intensity of a child who has found something that belongs entirely to him, that requires nothing of the family context, that exists in a space where he is just a player and the score is either good or not good, and there is no ambient grief. Taejun came to the 4th game. He arrived without announcement, took a seat 3 rows up in the bleachers without making his presence known to Caleb, and sat there for the full game with his elbows on his knees in the hunched, focused posture of a man watching something that matters to him. Imani was at the end of the bench with Amelia in a carrier against her chest, because Amelia at 4 months was entering the phase where being put down was something she regarded as a personal offense, and Imani had decided to stop fighting it and just carry her everywhere until the phase passed. She saw Taejun come in. She nodded. He nodded. They occupied the same gymnasium for an hour without speaking, which was itself a kind of progress. The 2 people who had been through what they had been through could sit in the same room around something they both loved and not make it about themselves. Caleb scored 6 points. The second basket, a layup that required him to drive left and compensate for a defender who had his right side, was genuinely good. The kind of small athletic moment that reveals something about the mind inside the body, the split-second adjustment, the trust in the instinct. When the ball went through the net, Caleb landed and looked up at the bleachers. He found his mother first. She raised one hand, a small acknowledgement. Then he looked, with a fractional hesitation that probably nobody else in the gymnasium clocked, at his father. Taejun was already clapping, not the performance clapping of someone wanting to be seen clapping. The involuntary, slightly delayed clapping of someone who had just watched something they were proud of and whose hands moved before the thought did. Caleb's face did something complicated and brief, and then he was back in the game, running, leaving the moment behind the way athletes do because the next moment was already there and required him. Imani looked away from both of them. She adjusted Amelia in the carrier. The baby had fallen asleep against her chest in the particular collapsed trust of someone who has decided that wherever they are is safe enough for unconsciousness. She watched her son play basketball. After the game, in the parking lot, Taejun walked over. He spoke to Caleb first. She hung back with Naomi and let it happen. Let the 2 of them have a 3-minute conversation by the entrance that she couldn't hear and didn't try to. Caleb had his gym bag over one shoulder and was still slightly flushed from the game, and he listened to whatever Taejun said with the careful face of a boy deciding how much to give. And then he said something back, and Taejun put his hand briefly on his son's shoulder. Caleb didn't move away from the hand. That was enough for today. The Malibu house appeared in her inbox in July, sent by a real estate contact she'd worked with on the Denver satellite office expansion, who had remembered, in the way that good agents remember things, that she'd mentioned during a conversation 18 months earlier that she wanted, eventually, a place near water that wasn't Seattle water. The Pacific, she'd said, the real Pacific, the kind that didn't apologize for itself. She almost deleted the email. She was at the Westlake office at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, going through the Foundation's quarterly program report, Amelia asleep in the portable crib that now lived in the corner of her office, because the idea of leaving her anywhere that wasn't within arm's reach was still something Imani was working on releasing. She opened the email. 3-bedroom house on a bluff above the Pacific, west of the highway, built in the early 90s by an architect who had clearly been more interested in light than in impressing anyone. Wood and glass and concrete set into the hillside at an angle that caught the afternoon sun across every room. A back deck that cantilevered over the drop to the water, with the beach visible below and nothing between the deck and the horizon except the particular enormous democracy of the Pacific. It was not a showpiece. It had marks of actual habitation. The kitchen had been renovated by someone who cooked in it, with a layout that prioritized function over display. The master bathroom had a window seat that somebody had once used for reading and had left small scratches in the paint around it from years of sitting. The garden was overgrown in the direction that gardens go when they've been loved and then left, which meant the bones were good and the character was intact, and what it needed was attention rather than reconstruction. She flew down on a Tuesday in August. She walked through the rooms. She stood on the back deck for 11 minutes without moving, looking at the Pacific. She bought it in cash before she flew home. She did not agonize over the decision. She had spent too many years agonizing over decisions that turned out not to deserve it, and not enough years trusting the first clean response to something. That particular stillness that had come over her on the deck, the sense of a space that was exactly sized for the life she was actually building rather than the life she had been maintaining. The birthday celebration for the twins was the last weekend of September. Naomi and Caleb turning 14, which was a number that felt different from 13 in ways that were difficult to articulate but were entirely real. The way certain years are simply years where the person inside the child shifts into a slightly different configuration that's going to hold longer. She had driven the 3 children down from Seattle 2 days before, a drive that required 2 stops for Amelia-related necessities, and 1 stop because Caleb claimed to be on the verge of starvation despite having eaten 4 hours earlier, which she was not going to argue about because he was 14 and growing, and she had learned to pick her battles with the conservatism of a woman who knows there are only so many of them worth fighting. Patricia had flown in the day before, and had already, by the time Amani arrived, cleaned the kitchen, restocked the refrigerator, and set up the spare bedroom with the quiet efficiency of a woman who expresses affection through logistics. 3 of the twins' closest friends had flown in, 1 from Seattle, 1 from Atlanta, where she'd moved with her family the previous year, 1 from Portland, as the primary birthday gift, because Amani had understood for years that what her children wanted most was not things but the people they loved in the same room, and that she had the ability to make that happen and had not always prioritized it, and that she was done not prioritizing it. The day was cold for September, which was the Pacific for you. The beach below the bluff was accessible by a wooden staircase that Amani had gripped with both hands on her first trip down, and that the children took at a run, careless in the way of people whose bodies have not yet taught them to be cautious about vertical distances. Amelia, 10 months old and newly committed to walking. She had taken her first steps 3 weeks earlier and had not stopped moving since, with the slightly staggered determination of someone who has discovered a capability and intends to fully exploit it, made it down 4 stairs before Amani picked her up. Amelia objected. "I know," Amani told her, descending with her daughter on one hip and one hand on the rail. "Life is full of disappointments." Amelia considered this and grabbed Amani's braid. On the beach, the teenagers ran. They ran in the direction teenagers run when adults have stepped back and the world is temporarily just wind and sand, and the complete present tense aliveness of 14, arms out, shoes abandoned, somewhere at the base of the stairs, voices lost in the sound of the surf. Naomi ran with her head back and her braid coming loose, and for exactly 1 moment she looked so unguardedly, completely happy that Amani had to look away, because the feeling it produced was too large to look at directly. Caleb picked up Amelia from the sand. She had immediately sat down and begun a serious investigation of a piece of kelp, and held her over his head while she shrieked with delight, and then swung her sideways and held her against his chest, and she grabbed his face with both hands. In the confident way she grabbed everything that she wanted to examine more closely. Amani stood where the wet sand met the dry and watched her children. Patricia came to stand beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. The Pacific was doing what the Pacific does in September. Gray-green and enormous and entirely itself, the waves coming in at the patient, powerful interval of something that has been doing this for longer than any human context and will continue long after. The sound of it was the kind of sound that rearranges the scale of things, that makes the last 14 months, with all their enormity, also somehow comprehensible as a single human story, one of millions happening simultaneously on every shore. "This is a good place," Patricia said. "Yeah," Imani said. "You chose well." Imani thought about the deck and the 11 minutes she'd stood on it, and the stillness that had told her without any deliberation that this was the answer to a question she'd been carrying for years without fully forming it. "I'm getting better at trusting what I know," she said. Patricia looked at her. "You always knew it. You just used to talk yourself out of it." Imani didn't argue with that. That evening, after the sun went and the friends were inside watching something on television, and Amelia had finally surrendered to sleep. With the full-body collapse of a child who has been intensely alive all day and has run entirely out of fuel, Patricia brought 2 cups of tea to the back deck and sat beside Imani in the dark and handed her one. They sat with the Pacific in front of them, invisible now except where the waves caught the diffused light and showed themselves briefly white before pulling back. The sound of it was constant. It had been constant all day and would be constant all night and would be constant tomorrow and next week and in 10 years. And there was something in that constancy that was not comfort exactly. Comfort was too soft a word, but was something more like company. "Tell me how you actually are," Patricia said. Imani held the cup with both hands. The tea was warm, the night was cold. "I'm tired," she said, "and I'm okay. I keep being surprised that those 2 things can exist at the same time." "They can," Patricia said. "They do. You just have to stop expecting one to cancel the other." Imani looked at the dark water. "I've been thinking about what I carried," she said, "before all of this. How much of it wasn't mine?" Patricia was quiet, listening. "I built everything," Imani said, "and I told myself that was strength, that being the one who holds it all together means you're strong." She wrapped her hands tighter around the cup. "But some of what I was holding was his. Some of it was his family's. Some of it was just the idea that if I kept everything standing, then the love had to be real. Because why would I work that hard for something that wasn't real?" She paused. "That's not strength. That's a deal you make with yourself that the other person never agreed to." "No," Patricia said, "it isn't strength, but it is human." "I'm not going to do it again," Imani said. "Not with anyone. Not with myself either. I carried things for myself that I should have put down. The idea of the marriage I wanted it to be. The version of him I needed him to be." She looked at her tea. "I carried those for a long time after I should have put them down." "Most people do," Patricia said. "I don't want to be most people on that one." Patricia almost smiled. "No, you never did." Inside, Caleb laughed at something. That open, unself-conscious laugh that Imani knew, with the bittersweet precision of a mother, would become rarer as he got older, would get tucked away behind the growing architecture of adolescent composure, and that she wanted to hear as many times as possible while it was still this free. She turned and looked through the glass doors at the light inside her house. Her house. The children visible through the glass, Naomi's braid half undone, Caleb with his feet on the ottoman, the friends distributed across the furniture in the comfortable randomness of teenagers who have stopped performing ease and actually found it. Amelia asleep somewhere down the hall in the portable crib, breathing in the reliable rhythm of a child with no reason to be otherwise. "Naomi asked me last week," Imani said, "if I was lonely." Patricia looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said sometimes yes, and that lonely and alone weren't the same thing." She paused. She thought about that for a while, and then she said she understood, because she's 14 and she already understands more than she should. "She's going to be something," Patricia said. "She already is something," Imani said. She put her cup down on the arm of the chair and sat with the sound of the ocean and the warmth of the light from inside the house and the cold of the September night on her face, and she let herself be in it, fully, without management, without the part of her brain that was always cataloging what needed to happen next. She let the moment be the size it actually was. It was large, and it was hers. When she thought about the restaurant, the white tablecloth, the candle, the envelope slid across the table like a termination of service, she found that the image had lost some of its texture. Not erased. She didn't believe in erasing things, but it had receded to its appropriate size, one moment in a chain of moments, the one that had broken something open, which it turned out had needed breaking. She thought about the things she had learned in the 14 months since that dinner. She had learned that she was more resourceful under pressure than she had known, which was good, and that she had become more resourceful under pressure than was entirely healthy, which was the correction she was working on. She had learned that love, the real kind, the kind that is not a transaction and not a performance, does not require you to carry what belongs to someone else. It asks for presence. It asks for honesty. It asks for the willingness to let the other person be accountable for their own weight. She had learned that the children she had spent 12 years trying to protect from difficulty were more capable of handling difficulty than she had given them credit for, and that protecting them from reality was its own kind of harm, and that what they needed from her was not a shield, but a model. She had learned that forgiving someone was not the same as trusting them, and that trust and forgiveness moved on entirely separate timelines, and that conflating them was a way of cheating yourself out of both. She had learned that there was a version of her life that was smaller in some ways than the one she'd had. Fewer rooms, fewer accounts, fewer people who needed things from her. And that the smaller version was not a diminishment. It was more like a room you finally cleared enough to see clearly. She had learned, most slowly and with the most resistance, that being alone with yourself is not a condition to fix. It is a capacity to develop. And that once developed, it changes what you're willing to accept from other people, because you no longer need to accept less than you deserve to avoid the alternative. She was 38 years old. She had 3 children and 2 companies and a rebuilt foundation and a mother on the chair beside her and an ex-husband who was slowly, imperfectly, with visible effort and occasional backsliding, learning to be accountable. She had the Malibu house and the sound of the Pacific and the gray at her temples she'd decided to keep, and the hair she'd cut herself at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday because she'd wanted to and no longer needed anyone's opinion on it. She had not become bitter. That had been the thing she'd been most afraid of in the earliest weeks. Not the money, not the legal complexity, not the loneliness of the nights, but the possibility that she would come through all of it with something hardened permanently in the center of her, something that looked at people and saw only what they might eventually cost. She had watched that happen to people she knew. She had understood, up close, how it happened. She had not let it happen. She was still capable of extending toward people, still capable of choosing trust with eyes open, still capable of sitting on a deck above the Pacific with her mother and feeling the size of the ocean without it feeling like a threat. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole thing. From somewhere down the hall, Amelia made the sound she made when she was approaching the edge of waking. Not a cry, more of a declaration. The sound of a person who has decided that whatever she was doing before she was asleep was probably important, and she should get back to it. Amani set down her tea. "I've got her," Patricia said. "No." Amani was already standing. "I've got it." She walked through the glass doors into the warm light of the house, past the teenagers who barely registered her passing in the way of teenagers who are comfortably absorbed in their own world, down the hallway where the sound was getting more definitive, into the small room where Amelia had determined that sleep was over. She leaned into the crib. Amelia looked up at her with the immediate, total attention of a 10-month-old for whom the world was still a place where every arrival was significant and worthy of full consideration. Her dark eyes, wide-set, the Whitaker eyes, focused on her mother's face with the complete, uncomplicated recognition of a child who has not yet learned to qualify her certainty about where she belongs and who belongs to her. She reached both arms up. Amani picked her up. Amelia grabbed a fistful of Amani's hair with the confident possessiveness she brought to everything, and Amani winced and worked it free and shifted her daughter onto her hip and stood in the hallway of the house above the Pacific, with this small and determined person warm against her side. "You're going to be a handful," Amani told her. Amelia looked at her with the expression of someone who considers that a reasonable assessment and has no objection to it. "Yeah," Amani said. "I know. Me too." She carried her daughter down the hallway toward the warm light of the living room, toward the sound of her older children and their friends, toward the glass doors and the dark ocean beyond them, and her mother with her tea and the cold September air, toward all of it, the whole complicated, imperfect hers. She walked through the door.